And quite simply, we have today one of the leading, if not the leading, sociologist of religion in the world. Dr. Peter Berger is currently Professor Emeritus of Religion, Sociology, and Theology at Boston University. He has served as the director of the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Boston University since 1985. And that institute was previously known as the Institute for the Study of Economic Culture. So economics, culture, religion, and world affairs. It's a pretty restrictive institute that he's been directing. And currently, he's emeritus there, and he serves as a senior research fellow, where he's told me he has lots of time to continue writing books. That's what he's been up to. He's a native of Austria. Professor Berger came to the United States as a young man. He received his PhD in sociology from the New School for Social Research in New York City in 1954. Since then, he's taught at numerous institutions, including the University of Georgia, Columbus, the Evangelical Academy in Bad Boll, Germany, the New School for Social Research, Rutgers University, Boston College, and finally, Boston University. I'm only partly joking when I say that listing books he has either written, edited, or co-authored would exhaust our complete time today, but let me at least mention a few. And I'm not sure if I have all the dates right here. The Social Construction of Reality, 1966, a co-authored work. The Sacred Canopy, 1967. A Rumor of Angels, 69. The Homeless Mind, Modernization and Consciousness, 1973. To Empower People, written with Richard John Newhouse in 1977. The Heretical Imperative, 1979. Skipping a couple of decades here. The Desecularization of the World, 1999. Mini Globalizations, Cultural Diversity in the Contemporary World, 2002. Religious America, Secular Europe, ? 2008, which is our topic today. And actually, we're already behind one book because he's recently come out with another co-authored work entitled In Praise of Doubt, How to Have Convictions Without Becoming a Fanatic, this year, 2009. And he's actually doing a public discussion of this 2 nights today, Wednesday night in Boston. So I think I've only skipped about 20 or 30 books there, but we'll let it rest there. As you can tell by the titles, we're honored today to have a scholar of immense breadth and insight. Many of these books have been translated into foreign languages and have come out in recent editions. They're regularly assigned in universities and colleges, and his scholarship has been the subject of articles and dissertations and books, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. What I personally admire about Professor Berger's work is its interdisciplinary breadth. It's definitely rooted in the discipline of sociology, but it reaches out to much broader audiences and draws insights from economics, political science, theology, history, and more. There's a nice word in his native language, German, called a Fachidiot, which we might translate as a disciplinary idiot, someone who is highly trained in a particular area and often within a subspecialty within an area of specialization. And unfortunately, that does characterize a lot of the modern academy, but that's not true of Dr. Berger's work at all. It's the opposite of this trend. And finally, it's while he writes for academic audiences, he's also what I would call a public intellectual, and that his writings have implications for and impacts on public policy, international relation, financial markets. So it's an understatement to say that it's a tremendous honor and pleasure to have him with us today and to engage in this conversation. But to paraphrase John the Baptist, my words must decrease and his words increase as we go on, and that we'll all engage in a conversation here. So let me just begin. I thought for the first question I was going to ask you, what was the guiding question behind this book? And then I looked at the back, and you and your co-authors have spelled it out here. So let me just read this. Europe is a relatively secular part of the world in global terms. Why is this so? And why is the situation in Europe so different from that in the United States? So I was going to see if you would want to either elaborate on the question or set of questions that led you to this project, or to begin to give us a summary of the argument you developed.
Well, the idea that America is religious and Europe is secular is not an original idea. And it's, let me jump to the conclusion, it's basically correct. But like with any phenomenon, when you begin to look at it more carefully, it becomes more complicated. Now, the one fun of being one situation which makes for fun as a social scientist is when you can take a problem and stand it on its head. And that's what we did in this book. There are three authors, but the two major ones. My main collaborator was Grace Davey, who's a very brilliant British sociologist of religion. Also happens to be a lay canon of the Church of England, but that's another story. Her most book before this one has a very nice title, Europe the Exception. And what she does is exactly turning things on its head. People usually talk about American exceptionalism, both in America and outside the United States. And there's something to that. There are many aspects in which the United States is a very exceptional society. One may add, in some ways, less attractive than others. But in terms of religion, it is not exceptional at all. Most of the world is very religious. The United States is a very religious society. The exception is Europe. And what Grace Davey and I were interested in, and the third author is a Greek, young, very brilliant young woman, a Greek sociologist who was a student of Grace Davey, but Grace and I were the major authors. And the interesting question is, why is Europe different? Europe is the exception, and in terms of science, whether social or any other kind of science, it's the exception that you want to look at. Well, I have bad knees, arthritic knees. If your knees are normal, the doctor isn't interested in them. If your knees are not normal, you want to look at what's wrong, what can be done about it. Well, it's very much the same in social science. So I would say, in terms of the sociology of religion, the most interesting area in the world is not Iran. There are Muslim mullahs there. There have always been mullahs. There are people who want holy war. Nothing new. What's new is a big chunk of the planet in which one can really talk about secularity. And Western and Central Europe is the major area of which this is true. A few other areas, Australia is one, I don't know too much about it, but Europe is the most important. So the question of why is Europe different from America is a very interesting one. It's also interesting in a different way because people who believe that the world is becoming more and more secularized have difficulty with the United States. There's been so-called secularization theory, which was the idea, has a long history, that the more modern a society is, the less religious it will be. Well, the United States is difficult to put into that framework. And it's difficult to argue that the United States is less modern than, say, Belgium. So why isn't it as secular as Belgium? Very interesting question.
You've coined the term Euro-secularity to describe what you're after here, but as you well know, Europe is a very big place, from Belgium to Spain to Greece to the Scandinavian countries. And I guess my simple question is, how can you generalize about all of Europe, or within, and you do not do that in the book, but maybe to put it in a more precise question, what are some of the interesting differences within Europe that you and your co-authors have laid out?
Well, I mean, one can ask, how can one generalize about anything? I mean, you can say Scandinavians are blonde. Well, many Scandinavians are blonde. There are more blonde Scandinavians than blonde Sicilians, but there are lots of Scandinavians who are not blonde. So, I mean, Europe, yes. How do you generalize? Well, I think you can generalize that certainly compared to the United States, which is the most interesting comparison, because you're dealing with two highly modernized parts of the world. Any part of Europe right now is much less religious than the United States by any criterion you want to use. And the two major criteria are objective criteria, behavioral criteria, how many people go to religious services, how many people become clergy, etc., and the subjective criteria. How do people respond to questions about, do they believe in God or in Christ or in life after death or whatever? Any of these criteria you want to use, Europe is much less religious than the United States. So it's important also in terms of our understanding of modernity. You can have a modern society which is very religious. So it's a rather significant question.
Okay, I might come back to follow up on that one, but I thought since today is November the 9th and we're commemorating the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, I was going to see if you might say something about how, either in your thinking in this book or generally, the role of communism figures in the history of modern Europe, especially vis-a-vis religion. I mean, it seems like the legacy of communism has often had very, very different reactions. If I could, even point to border nations where it seems like in Poland that has triggered a resurgence of Catholicism in the 20th century, where if you go to East Germany, it seems to have just accelerated processes of secularization, where today in the former East Germany and Czech Republic would be some of the most secular areas of the world, where if you look at Slovakia and Poland, they've both experienced the communist period. What explains such big differences within Europe?
Well, there are differences even within Western Europe, but certainly if you go to Eastern Europe, it becomes very interesting. Well, I mean, the communist regimes in the erstwhile Soviet Empire made a very concentrated effort to suppress religion. Not always with the same degree of ferocity, but on the whole, they were anti-religious regimes. And I think the differences, explaining differences, well, Poland is the most religious country in the former Central Europe, communist Central Europe. Czech Republic is the least religious. And this is not my field, I speak neither languages, so I have to rely on other people. But what people tell me is you have to look at the history. And in the case of Poland, the Catholic Church was a central element of Polish national identity, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, which ruled much of Poland for quite a long time. So to be Polish and to be Catholic was almost, well, for a long time was almost identical. Czech Republic had a very different history. It had you had the not anti is the wrong word, the dissident Catholic movement associated with Jan Hus, who was burned at the stake by the Inquisition. You had a strong nationalist movement in the Czech lands, which was anti-Catholic. You had a significant Protestant minority. So it's a very different history. And to be Czech did not mean to be Catholic in the same way as in Poland. In fact, Czech nationalism had to assert itself against the Habsburg Empire, which was a consciously Catholic empire. So I think in answer to your question, one has to look at the history, which in each country is different. However, here I come back to what irritates, all historians don't like generalizations. All sociologists like generalizations. So despite this concession to, significant differences, I would still say that Europe is a secular place, and it's a secularizing place. And I argued that, in things I've written in recent years, that Eurosecularity, the term which I like to use, it's a fun term, is part of the European cultural package. And the closer a society gets to Europe, the more likely it is to buy into secularity as well. Now, is this a law? No, there are no laws in society. A couple of years ago, I lectured in Poland, and an inconvenient member of an event like this read me something I had written a few years ago, which I had forgotten, where I had written that The European Union uses the French term acquis. It means when you want to have accession to the European Union, you have to sign a number of documents, including, I believe, 8,000 pages of European law. Well, I said part of the acquis, not just to the European Union, but to European culture, is secularity. And it will affect Poland as it has affected Ireland. He read that to me and said, would you still say this? This was about 2 years ago. And I was sort of embarrassed. And I said, I don't know. You tell me. Is Poland going this way? And there was a heated discussion, which I said nothing, where some people said, yes, it's becoming more and more secular. The Catholic Church has lost influence. There are all these people who pay no attention to the Catholic Church in their lives. And others said, no, Poland is different. It's going to remain different. I don't know. I think the probability is Poland will become more like the rest of Europe. But I may be wrong.
Is that because of new legal norms, greater wealth creation, or what would be the Europeanization of Poland would also trigger potentially secularization? Is that what you're arguing down the road? Okay.
What's already happened, the Catholic Church has lost much of its influence. And the Catholic Church, with the Solidarity movement, played a crucial role in the collapse of the communist regime. When the communist regime collapsed, that role rather quickly diminished. Which, by the way, happened dramatically in East Germany.
Right. Yeah. What about, if I can just continue to probe the generalization a little bit here. It seems that, one enigma to me is that of Great Britain. And viewed historically, it seems to track with the United States in terms of its revivalism, and for much of the 19th and 20th century, that it differs from continental Europe and tracks more with. But then in the post-war period, especially in the 1960s, it sort of pivots and begins to demographically track with the continent. Is that a fair assessment of Great Britain, and what explains Great Britain has become less American and more European?
You're the historian, but
you're the thing.
I think that began earlier than the 50s. I think World War I was a dividing period in Britain. That's what I read, that after World War I, the sort of the church-going, being a Christian was part of bourgeois respectability, rather dramatically declined. I don't know. But the question still is interesting. Why did Europe become more like Britain become more like Europe than like America? I'm not sure I know, but I think that you're right. Certainly since World War II, there has been a kind of European culture with enormous attraction. A package, I call it. It's a European package. And secularity is part of it. And Britain was sucked into this, I think, long before the United Kingdom joined the European Union. It was part of that cultural package. That's how I see it.
Excuse me. One of the key terms you use throughout the book is that of multiple modernities, or multiple paths or roads to modernity. And I know you draw some from the historian Gertrude Himmelfarb.
Gertrude Himmelfarb, yeah.
In explaining the separate trajectories of the United States and Europe. Could you maybe unpack a little bit what you mean by these terms, and what would be the characterizations? Especially thinking of the European-American transatlantic contrast.
The term multiple modernities was coined a few years ago by an Israeli sociologist, Shmuel Eisenstadt, who wrote a very influential essay with that title. And what he meant was that modernity is not all of one piece. There are different modernities. Eisenstadt, and I fully agree with this, is very interested in Japan, which is the most interesting case of what he calls multiple modernities, because it's the first non-Western society which very successfully modernized. And while Japan is a very modern society today, it's not like the West. It's different. It's an alternate modernity. In terms of Europe, if you compare, you're dealing with, when you compare Europe and the United States, you're dealing with two highly modern societies. And one quite religious, the other much less so. and that needs explanation. Is that what you were getting at?
But I guess particularly, I mean, what would be some of the distinctives on the American side and the French or the European side that would?
Well, I mean, again, you can take both objective and subjective criteria. How many people go to church? And then very significant, what is the role of religion in the public sphere? And if you can say that the paradox in the United States is you have a very strict separation of church and state, but you don't have a separation of religion and politics. And I think the two, by the way, are very logically related. And Europeans are shocked by, when they come to America, how politicians talk about God and God bless America and prayer meetings to which everyone goes in Washington. So this is strange. On the difference, Tony Blair was a very religious man, a recent convert to Roman Catholicism, and somebody asked him, why does Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair was such a religious man, he never talks about religion in public. And one of his assistants says, we don't do God around here. Okay? Well, American politicians do God a lot. And it's politically advantageous for them to do God. So the differences are rather striking.
Just a follow-up question to that, and you can't say that I'm not a historian and throw the question back to me, because I assume history is a sociological factor at some level. But how much of this goes back to the American Revolution and the French Revolution? I think you and your co-authors, talk about the American Revolution being, especially vis-a-vis religion, is freedom for the practice of religion, where the French Revolution, there was much more anti-clericalism, sort of a freedom from religion, with the European religious wars in recent memory, and the position of the church in the Ancien regime. That we're talking about sort of deep-seated structural factors that are behind some of the demographic divergences.
Well, I think you haven't asked me why the difference, so let me anticipate that question, why the difference. Grace and I came out with 8 reasons why America is different from Europe when it comes to religion. We agreed that the most important one is separation of church and state. And that is not a new idea. De Tocqueville wrote about it, but it's a correct idea. Not old ideas are not necessarily wrong. I think there are other factors. But the separation of church and state is very important. And if you compare the United States and France, if you compare the two revolutions, as you just did, which is very revealing, because the French Revolution, French democracy had to assert itself against an ancien regime which was deeply Catholic. And in order to overthrow that regime, the revolutionaries and the Enlightenment thinkers that preceded the revolution had to also be against the Catholic Church. Famous statement by Voltaire, écraser l'infâme, destroy the infamy. What was the infamy? It was the Catholic Church. So the French notion of democracy, the French Republic, is deeply, maybe not anti-religious, so I think some of them were anti-religious, but the idea religion is a retrograde force which has to be kept out of the public sphere. That was meaningless in the United States. There never was a state church, except for 2 very unsuccessful attempts in Massachusetts and in Virginia. There were too many other people around. Then religious freedom became an essential element of the American political creed. So there was no infamy to rebel against. There was no anti-clericalism because there was no clerical regime. Instead, you had all kinds of people who came here with their religious traditions. They flourished in a kind of vacuum at first, and then flourished protected by the Constitution and by the laws which guaranteed religious freedom. So I think the historical roots of this are very clear. And Gertrude Himmelfarb, the historian that Tal just mentioned, wrote a very interesting book, 3 Paths to Modernity, where she compares France, Britain, and the United States as 3 different ways of dealing with the 3 different forms of the Enlightenment. in the 18th century and then the history that followed.
One factor in American religiosity that you identify is American evangelicalism, and you're sitting in an evangelical college, and you've noted that Europe, to no significant degree, has anything like the traditions of American evangelicalism. Could you maybe say, might be very interesting for this audience in particular, to say a little about the role, either in the book or in your own thinking, of American evangelicalism as contributing to American religious identity or American exceptionalism or lack of exceptionalism in global comparative terms?
Well, look, I mean, the term evangelical is flexible and no absolute fixed criteria. But if you take a usually accepted definition of evangelicalism, something at least 80 million Americans are evangelicals. And they tend to be quite religious. I mean, it's not simply a label. It is something, in fact, when I'm not evangelical, I like to say I'm evangelisch, but not evangelical. In German, evangelisch simply means Protestant. I'm Lutheran, which is not quite the same as what evangelical means in the United States. But you immediately recognize if you're in an evangelical milieu. I mean, that the culture is different. It's a very distinctive subculture within the United States with a huge demographic and significant influence, not just political, which interests the media, but cultural. I mean, it affects the way millions of people live, what they consider to be the good life. And since this is a democracy, these people vote, and they have an influence on what happens in the society. So I think there's nothing like it in Europe. There are some little groups that you might call evangelical. There's been, in the American sense, there's been a little uptick of some even Pentecostal groups in Europe, but it's pretty marginal. And there's nothing compared to the massive presence of evangelicalism in the United States, which is a very significant factor.
The historian Philip Jenkins, who we were talking about earlier, wrote a book a number of years ago entitled God's Continent, referring back to Europe. Are you familiar with this book?
Yes.
And I don't know if you necessarily were in his crosshairs, but he was trying to argue that really Europe has reached a nadir point and it can only kind of go up in terms of religiosity. I'm just curious how you would respond. And some of the factors that he marshaled are the presence of Islam, the papacy of John Paul II and World Youth Days and some emergent Catholic communities. Looking at some religious resurgence in Eastern Europe, Mormonism, pockets of these pockets, and his argument is that really trajectories are going to go in a different direction. If he were here, what would you say to Professor Jenkins?
Professor Jenkins. Well, I've met Professor Jenkins. I have a very high opinion of his work. Look. You mentioned a number of factors. World Youth Day I would not take very seriously. That's a celebrity event. There's a wonderful study by a number of people, I think Catholics with wishful thinking, have looked at these events, and this is the resurgence of Catholicism. A French sociologist whom I know quite well, Danielle Vieux-Leger, she made a study of World Youth Day, and some wonderful stories. One I like is a young man who said, it was the most wonderful experience of his life. He and his girlfriend shared a sleeping bag and finally had intercourse. This was quite apart from whatever Catholic stuff was going on. So, I mean, I would be a little cautious there. The presence of Islam I find more plausible. I think Catholics have some wishful thinking about some of these events, including the popes and but the presence of Islam is very interesting because it forces Europeans, first of all, to re-examine the place of religion in their own society. They are confronting a growing population which takes religion very seriously, which also, many of them refuse to have religion limited to the private sphere. So you have a kind of what the French call a prise de conscience, a reflection of in one's consciousness of what religion should be in society. Another thing that one has to look at is Grace Davey, my colleague, British colleague, said one has to look at what goes on under the radar. Because while a lot of Europeans, a majority of Europeans, are alienated from institutional religion, there are all kinds of things going on. For example, meditation, which is all over the place. People who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Some studies of what that means. And in many cases, it means something religious. It just means they don't feel comfortable in the church of their tradition. So there are a number of things going on which counteract the secularity of Europe. I would be very cautious, and all I would say is in the immediate, and some similar things in America which indicate the spread of something like secularity. For example, a higher number of Americans now say they have no religion in surveys. Again, one has to ask, what does that mean? And it's not a huge number, it's somewhere on, 12, 16%, something like that. Nevertheless, I would say I do not see any dramatic changes in the immediate future. So I think, unless something very unexpected happens, and unexpected things happen in history, I would say 20 years from now, I think we'll still be able to say America is more religious than Europe. So-called futurologists coined a wonderful term, surprise-free future. In other words, a future free of surprises. And then they say what they predict. Well, take a very unpleasant surprise. Suppose a single nuclear terrorist attack on a major American city. All bets are off. Or a European city. All bets are off. Now, there are less catastrophic possibilities one can look at. Economic changes, environmental changes. I would say none of these events are likely at this point. So probably no dramatic changes are in the offing.
Excuse me. Since you mentioned the work of Daniel Evu-Léger, she has this notion of tinkering for those who are religious in Europe or spiritual, that it plays out less in institutional forms than in kind of creating your kind of own portfolio of religious beliefs. Do you see that something as distinctly Europe? I would want to say that's very American, that has a transatlantic salience as well, and it's just a product of pluralism. Would you agree with that, or do you see that if I could isolate out a devout individual in Europe, speaking in terms of sociological generalization, and a devout individual in the United States, do they experience pluralism in similar ways, and does that manifest itself in the type of tinkering and creating sort of a cafeteria or pick and choose spirituality?
Yeah, Evu-Léger used the bricolage, which is roughly translated as tinkering, so like a Lego game. A kid puts together a building, a little piece from here, a little piece from there, and then that's the individual's religion. Robert Wathnow, who's a prominent sociologist of religion in the U.S., has used a different term. What does he call it? Patchwork religion. Same idea, like different patches making a blanket. I think pluralism everywhere, Europe, America, or anywhere else, creates a situation in which any religious tradition is no longer taken for granted, and people must choose how they define themselves religiously. So, in terms of the stuff that Evu-Léger deals with, she mostly studied French Catholicism. People say, yes, I'm Catholic, but, and then comes a list of things where they disagree with the church. So they put together their own Lego game of Catholicism. That is true, I think, both in Europe and the United States. People have to make choices. The difference is that in America, more people make religious choices, and in Europe, more people make secular choices.
The last chapter of your book, I think this is going to be my last official question, so you guys can begin thinking of the questions you would like to ask, is on, I can't remember exactly what it's entitled, but it's So What? Policy Implications. In the past few years or decades, there have been a lot of acrimony across the Atlantic. Some are speaking of a transatlantic gap, not just in religious matters, but in other matters, political matters, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what you hope this book would accomplish in terms of practical policy implications for transatlantic relations.
Well, we didn't write the book to end with a sort of political recommendation, but what we said was that there are lots of misunderstandings on the two sides of the Atlantic. Since Europe and the United States are the two major democratic forces in the world, this is unfortunate that there are these misunderstandings. And the religious difference is not the only misunderstanding, but it is one misunderstanding which is quite serious. And, well, as you have studied in great detail, I mean, Europeans have some very strange notions about religion in America. This came to a climax in the presidency of George W. Bush, but it happened before, and it's happening after Mr. Bush is gone. And vice versa. I mean, Americans have some strange ideas about Europe as an atheist, decadent place, no kids, headed for either part of Islam or oblivion. Well, those are misperceptions, and I think having a more nuanced view of what these two sides of the Atlantic are like is helpful.
Okay, well, at this point, we'll just throw it out to you. Why don't you just come up to the microphone?
Such a big group, we better say something significant.
Well, thank you for adding the pressure to my situation. I appreciate that. Hello again, Dr. Berger. My name is Gabriel Demaro. I'm a history, French, and linguistics major here at Gordon. I'm a senior. My question has to do with the multiple paths of modernity, specifically as it pertains to the secularization of a society, and not necessarily that different countries take different trajectories, but perhaps why is it that different countries take different paths of modernity. And in your article, you mentioned, I suppose, deep-seated cultural habits of mind that might perhaps condition the receptivity of a society to the pluralistic structure that comes with modernity. And I think specifically I'm thinking about the difference between the American intelligentsia as well coupled with Europe versus perhaps the Japanese experience of modernity. And I'm specifically thinking of perhaps different philosophical traditions that have characterized the West as opposed to the East. And in the West, I've come to the understanding that basically since Aristotle, Western philosophy has been characterized by binary oppositions, whereas perhaps Eastern philosophy has dealt more with paradox and A, it's not A or B, but A and B. And so I was wondering maybe if you had any comments as to perhaps why modernity is experienced in different ways as a result of deep-seated culturally embedded habits of mind.
Well, why don't we leave out the East for a moment, because if we have to talk about India or China, that becomes a bit complicated. But if we simply stick for the moment with Europe and America, which is the main topic of this discussion, look, in terms of pluralism, the United States is the vanguard society in terms of pluralism, simply because of the history of its population. I mean, people came here from all kinds of places, bringing with them all kinds of traditions, and pluralism in America had to mean that these people had to live with each other. And then, in a very natural progression, Thomas Jefferson had a lot to do with this. He pushed the first, my history is correct, the first Bill of Religious Freedom through the Virginia legislature, and freedom of religion became an American political ideology. very real in its effects. It's not just an ideology, it's a fact. Europe didn't have that history until very recently. And through much of European history, church and state were very closely linked. The Reformation didn't change that, certainly not the Lutheran or the Anglican Reformation. So a very different history. I think the pluralism of American society you see this now with immigration issues, makes American society much more capable of absorbing people from every conceivable background, usually without too much difficulty, which is very interesting. Europe has more difficulties. So there are very different histories here. I guess I'm repeating myself to some extent, but history is not, historians probably agree, it's not an absolute determination. It doesn't mean that everyone has to follow a historical pattern. But there is an influence that reaches across time and influences habits and beliefs. I don't know if that answers your question. But,
Other questions? Here we go.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Maud Sandbo. I'm a student at Gordon Conwell, and I'm interested in the process of secularization. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more in depth and breadth about the factors of that went into secularization in Europe. You talked a little bit about the political factors. If you could give us a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Well, I mentioned church-state relations, which I think is crucial. We came up with a number of other factors. Things that occurred in Europe that did not occur here and vice versa. In Europe, you had, because of the church-state situation, you had a development of parties of the left and trade unions, which had a kind of leftist ideology, which were strongly secular. The country where I originally come from, which is Austria, really had two very sharp cultural divide. Protestants were a minority in Austria. The two camps were the Catholic camp and the Social Democratic camp, and they had different institutions. And within the Social Democratic camp, there was certainly hostility toward the Catholic Church, and to some extent hostility toward religion in general. Nothing like that in the United States. Take the labor movement in America, was never anti-religious. One of the early American labor leaders, Samuel Gompers, some journalist asked him, "What does labor want?" And he said, "More." Nothing, no ideological thing. More. Very different from Europe. Take something else. European church institutions were organized on the local level territorially. You had a church in a particular community. The idea was that everybody belongs to that church. Didn't happen in America. It was impossible given the spatial arrangements. So American religion was sort of portable in a way in which European religion was not. The Methodist circuit rider was a good example of this, went all over the place and started little congregations. All of this led, one very nice phrase that Grace Davy uses, Europeans still today look on the church as a public utility. They don't have to make any effort. They don't have to invest, donations or effort or sort of activity. It's there if they want it. That's totally alien to the American way of thinking. If you join a church, very soon you get an envelope, how much you're supposed to contribute. You're asked to participate in various activities. It makes an enormous difference. Immigration is another very important factor. Churches in America and synagogues and now religious institutions of other religious traditions were a very important instrument to help immigrants adjust to American society. The churches were a kind of, transitional institution for immigrants. Let me mention one other factor, which as a sociologist I'm very interested in. Religion in America, and especially Protestantism, had a relationship to the class system, which never existed in Europe. Different denominations and different local churches had different places in the different positions in the class and status system of the society. Give you a good example, the letter of transfer. It's a very American institution. Still exists, I believe. I don't know if anybody still uses it. But it used to be, if you were, let's say, a Methodist in Massachusetts and you moved to Ohio, your church gave you a letter which said, Mr. Smith is a member in good standing of the First Methodist Church of whatever. And you took that letter and you went to Ohio to a Methodist church and said, aha, you're a good person to recruit. Well, that was in a way the first form of the credit card. Because what it meant was, if you were a good Methodist, you paid your bills, you didn't get drunk every weekend. It was a certification of bourgeois respectability. Nothing like that happened in Europe. And in fact, there's a very funny story. Max Weber, the famous sociologist, who wrote a little essay about American religion, which is quite interesting. And he had a hunch of what was going on there. More than a hunch, he understood it. And he tells the story, he traveled somewhere in the Middle West and talked to a recently arrived German dentist who said to him, these Americans are very strange. I just opened my practice and this man came in, sat in the, opened his mouth, closed his mouth again and said, I'm a member of the First Baptist Church, and then opened his mouth again. And the German dentist says, why did he have to tell me this? But nothing to do with his teeth. And Weber immediately understood what he said. What he said was, I'm a member of the First Baptist Church, I pay my bills. Don't worry about being paid, just take care of my teeth. Incomprehensible story in terms of Europe. In my own experience, I'd been in America for a while, but I had a colleague, this was in my first full-time teaching position was in the South, in North Carolina. And this guy told me his background was Baptist, but he had now become a Methodist, because he now was a university professor and he thought being a Baptist wasn't quite the right thing anymore. And I said to him, having some idea of the American class system, I said, well, why not Episcopalian? And he said, that would be pushing it. Well, that's a factor, a significant factor. Not very relevant today anymore, but very relevant through much of American history.
A question? Or on this side? Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Ingi Kim, and my question had to do with, you mentioned that Europe is a secularizing place, but then you also mentioned that Muslims refuse to separate their religion from the public sphere. So I was just wondering, which do you think will win out? Like Europe secularizing the Muslims that live in Europe, or Muslims influencing Europe itself?
That's the 64 million euro question. I would be cautiously optimistic. Look, I mean, the data we have is that the majority of Muslims in Europe want to be part of the European societies in which they live. They want to be citizens. They want religious freedom, but they accept the democratic state and they accept the fact that the state is going to be religiously neutral. Okay? However, there is a significant majority which is not satisfied with that, who wants the state to sort of publicly and even legally recognize certain Islamic principles, such as, for example, prohibiting what they consider to be blasphemy. Very interesting issue. Pushing for either new blasphemy laws or reviving old laws that prohibited blasphemy. So if you say something derogatory about Muhammad, you can be fined or imprisoned. Okay, that's a minority, but it's a very vocal minority. How is this going to come out? I don't know. Again, it depends on whether the future is going to be surprise-free. If it is going to be surprise-free, I would be cautiously optimistic. I think the European culture will be able to absorb most of these people. I mean, these people meaning the population that is Muslim.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jing, and I'm a business major studying Gordon College. I grew up in Hungary for 10 years, from 10 to
Where did
18.
you grow up?
Hungary. So I'm just wondering, I like the fact how are you making it, it sounds like you are not criticizing like the society, the secular society, but you're given in pretty much neutral perspective. I feel that's the way. And I'm just wondering, for a more secular society, do you see any like benefit of it if it's not, if it's not all religious? Is there any good things that a society, a country is secular? Thanks.
I don't know what you mean. Is it a good thing? From what point of view? From a religious point of view? From a moral point of view? From a moral point of view, there are many religious people who think that unless you are religious, you can't be moral. Morality necessarily depends on being religious. I don't think the empirical evidence supports that point of view. I think in many places you have people who are agnostic or atheist or otherwise not connected with religion who lead very admirable, morally admirable lives. From a religious point of view, well, it depends what religion you're talking about. I would say from a Christian point of view, first of all, from a Christian point of view, separation of church and state is very desirable from the point of view of Christian faith, because you don't want faith to be dependent on government coercion. So I would say the secular state, if by that one simply means not a state which is hostile to religion, that obviously is not desirable from a Christian point of view, but a state which is neutral. It doesn't enforce religion, it doesn't push any particular religion, is a good thing. It's good for religion, certainly including Christianity. And I think people are beginning to realize this. It's very interesting in the Muslim world. That point of view is becoming very, very strong in Iran, where you had, for the last 30 years or whatever, a deliberate attempt to create an Islamic state in a very coercive way. And people don't like it. And you get, even, I understand, in Qum, the holy city of Islamic learning in Iran, where you have young Muslim clerics who say, we don't want an Islamic state, it's bad for Islam. It gives Islam a bad name. So I think a state which is religiously neutral, not hostile to religion, but neutral, from the point of view of faith, is a good thing.
Sometimes the faculty, I was going to see if there's any, excuse me, sometimes the faculty dominate these discussions, but it's been all students, so I want to at least give my colleagues a chance. And I was going to say, you don't have to, if you're not going to ask your question, if you don't have to come down, but Steve's down, so go ahead, Steve.
I'm Steve Alter. I teach U.S. history here at Gordon College. Professor Berger, this is a very traditional question from the standpoint of Americans who are always curious. What do they think of us? What do Europeans think of us? Purely out of curiosity, how would today, and I think Tal's been studying this historically and may have some answers on this too, how would continental European theorists explain? We always hear how surprised they are, how amazed they are at the religiosity of American society. Well, how do they give a rational explanation which of what to them apparently is irrational?
Well, I think Tal is in a better position to answer that question than me. That's what this recent book is about. I have no, I mean, there are about, 300 million people in Europe. They have different opinions of America. But among intellectuals, there's a widespread notion, and it came to a kind of climax in the George W. Bush administration, that America is a very religious country. Who knows why? Basically barbaric, and American foreign. Well, there are two conspiracy theories. Either American policy in the world is dictated by the Jewish lobby, or it is dictated by some dark evangelical forces of born-again fanatics. That's a very widespread view in Europe. To that extent, the arrival of Obama has been a good thing, because it's very difficult to put him into either conspiracy theory. I don't know. I mean, I think you should speak to that, Hal. I haven't made a
maybe
step.
I'll just say a quick word, and I'd be curious to hear your response. I mean, part of my own argument is that Europeans have always had a much broader, what I would call political bandwidth, going back to the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, there was a whole group that wanted to restore throne and altar. So you had a development of a kind of organic conservatism that was extremely reactionary and extremely anti-Americanism. I think a lot of that comes from, not from the European left, but from the European right historically, that they thought this was just the experiment in religious freedom was just an insanity. That's a word that the philosopher Hegel even used. This is a verrückt. This is just a madhouse over there. And in some ways it was in the 19th century, as you know, Steve, and a lot of the revivals and different apocalyptic groups. But also Europe has had a much more leftist, anti-clerical tradition that really wanted to kind of overthrow the Catholic Church and the established church, and a lot of intellectuals sort of associated modernity with a kind of anti-clerical secularity. And so when they didn't see that in the United States, that was kind of a puzzle to be explained. And that's maybe some of the origins of secularization theory, was sort of explaining that puzzle, but that often assumed kind of a European benchmark. Yardstick was always sort of the European experience of the French Revolution, and the anti-clericalism and Marxism was always kind of the unspoken bar. But beside that, there is a very large centrist tradition, in which I would include Alexis de Tocqueville and others. So it's not at these extreme ends, but it's there are many very sympathetic figures like Philip Schaff or Jacques Maritain, someone else I treat, that has a much more nuanced approach. That you can't. I'm just trying to kind of come up with the right categories, and those are three that I've developed.
Raymond Aron.
Aron
was
would be
a
another
very
one
good example.
in France.
Yeah. No, I mean, you have different approaches, but I mean the idea that American religion is sort of a strange thing, and which one must have a little to do with as possible, is still very common among European intellectuals. And the bafflement with American religion. I'll give you a good example of what Grace Davy means by religion as a public utility. If I may tell a personal anecdote, I came to America as a very young man and almost immediately went to college. And I was a student at the Lutheran College in Ohio. I was a Lutheran, so they gave me a scholarship at Wittenberg College in Ohio. And I had a Finnish girlfriend. And I was interested in religion, and there was a revival going on in Springfield, Ohio. And we went. She rather reluctantly came along. And it was a typical American revival service. And they had the call from the altar, and people were asked to come forward and accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And the ushers were coming toward us to invite people to come to the altar. And she was sitting to my left on the aisle. And as the ushers came close, I could see her sort of stiffening up. And the usher came to her and said, "Sister, are you saved?" And she replied with a heavy Finnish accent, which I can't imitate. She said, "I'm a member of the Lutheran Church of Finland," which completely puzzled him. But I think he took it as a yes, because he didn't ask me, I was with her, so I was okay. And he went on. Well, the answer in a way was crazy. It wasn't an answer to his question. From her point of view, it was perfectly sensible. What do you mean I'm saved? I'm a member of the Lutheran Church of Finland. So, I mean, that's religion as a public utility. She wasn't particularly religious at all, but that was her notion of what it meant to be a Lutheran or a Christian. So I think there still is a considerable gulf. Now, that was some years ago, but I don't think it's changed dramatically.
questions? Or? Yep.
I'm Scott Pichard and a student here. And how do you think the Jewish Holocaust has affected the religious secularity in Europe? And do you think that it's mostly led to religious doubt and also a cultural pressure not to practice religion and express your beliefs in God because of such a tragic event, and an event in some ways may have been in the name of God?
Or just maybe just the question of Judaism and transatlantic perspective. Is that something you've given any thought to?
Well, the Holocaust has been very much a reality in European consciousness. By no stretch of the imagination can one argue that the Holocaust was made in the name of God. I mean, Nazism was not a religious movement. In fact, in many ways, it was an anti-Christian movement. So I think to blame Christianity for the Holocaust, yeah, there have been some writings that argue that Christian anti-Semitism was somehow the roots of Nazism. It's a historical question which is complicated. But I don't think what the Holocaust has done in terms of European philosophy and theology, it has raised in a very graphic way the old question of theodicy. How can God permit suffering and evil in the world? And the Holocaust has become kind of an icon of absolute evil. In that sense, it has had a significant role, and there are a number of European thinkers, especially Christian thinkers, well, obviously Jewish thinkers, but Christian thinkers also very much so, who have dealt with the Holocaust within the context of the question of theodicy. In terms of general consciousness in Europe, I don't think it's much related to the issue of secularity. Judaism in Europe now, because of what happened under the Nazis, is not a very large community. There's been I guess the biggest community is in France. France and Britain are probably very close. There has been a kind of revival, religious revival, among European Jews, some of which had more to do perhaps with ethnic identity than with Judaism as a religion. But there is a kind of Orthodox movement going on, to some extent supported by institutions in the United States. I don't know what else to say. I don't think it's a very significant, come back to the Holocaust, it's a very significant reality in terms of European consciousness. I don't think it has much to do with their attitude to secularity. I may be wrong. What do you think?
I don't think it really connects with the religious questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you on behalf of my students. I'm a sociologist here at Gordon College, and you've been introducing students to sociology for 15 or 16 years since I've been teaching. With your invitation to sociology, the book that introduced me to sociology when I was an undergraduate at Gordon, working with Stan Gady. But there's an interesting part of your text that was bandied about by feminists in graduate school, where you refer to the sociologist as a peeping Tom. And you also discuss kind of the inquisitive nature of sociology. Many Christians find sociologists problematic for that inquisitive nature. And I'm wondering if there's been a different appreciation of you in Europe amongst people who claim faith in the United States, or is there a different sort of understanding what sociology is and what it's about, especially in regard to the study of religion?
Not really. I don't think so. I mean, in terms of sociologists who deal with religion, there are some people in the United States that I found congenial and that find me congenial, and there are some in Europe. I don't see any sharp differences there between Europe and the United States. Since Europe generally, European intelligentsia tends to be more secular than Americans, I suppose there are more secular sociologists in Europe than there are here. But one thing about America, which we didn't touch upon, which I think is very interesting, is that the American intelligentsia, I don't know since when, but certainly since World War II, has become, I would use the term, Europeanized, which is something relatively new. I think it's basically a post-World War II phenomenon. So if you look at the American population as a whole, and we have some hard data on this, intellectuals, especially in the social sciences and humanities, are more secular than the general population. I think the most quoted sentence I've ever written, I wrote this some years ago, I said, if you look at sociology of religion, one of the most religious countries in the world is India. You take 3 steps in India and you stumble over 5 gods. And one of the most secular countries in the world is Sweden, where something like minus 5% of the population believes in God. I'm slightly exaggerating. Well, I said the United States can be described as a nation of Indians with a Swedish cultural elite. And that cultural dichotomy explains a lot of what's happened in American politics over the last 40 years. And one of the ways I've talked about this in Europe, describing this role, this religion in America, is to say that, since I'm in this evangelical milieu, I will use my language carefully, that the how shall I put it, that the Indians have become increasingly annoyed at the Swedes. I've used somewhat stronger language, but very significant fact, and you can date it in terms of American politics. There are 2 crucial dates, both, interestingly enough, occasioned by the least democratic institution of the American political system, namely the Supreme Court. 1963, the decision on prayer in the public schools. 1973, Roe versus Wade. And these 2 decisions, hailed by the Europeanized intelligentsia in America, infuriated millions of religious Americans. And this dichotomy, I think, is very interesting. I don't think it's terribly significant in terms of sociology, except that most sociologists are, well, all sociologists are intellectuals, and they by and large share the prejudices of the intelligentsia of which they are a part, which tend to be secular. But the European sociologists are secular almost by definition, so I don't think there's any great difference there.
Your former student, James Hunter, was an undergraduate here, and you're sort of getting into culture wars discussion here, and I just thought I would throw in the question of his notion of culture wars. Do you think that still stands as a way of thinking about some of the divisions in American society and politics today?
Yeah. Alan Wolfe wrote a book, basically an anti-Hunter book, in which he wrote that there is no culture war, and the data he used, which are perfectly correct, is that if you look at culturally divisive issues, abortion or homosexuality or you name it, most Americans are somewhere in the middle. So Wolfe argues, well, therefore there's no culture war, most Americans are sort of in the middle. What he doesn't pay attention to is that cultural wars are usually conducted by minorities. And you have very active minorities, rather small groups of activists on both sides. They are waging the war. But because they are very active, they have a very strong influence. And I would say more or less by accident. There's nothing, I think, that was inevitable about that. The one group of activists became an important constituency for the Democratic Party, and the other group for the Republican Party. And that has been a factor for quite a couple of decades at least. Whether this will continue remains to be seen. And I think there's some data that this may be weakening.
Just looking at the clock here, but we have time for a few more questions. And this gentleman who came down earlier.
Hi, Dr. Berger. My name is Lyle Mook. I'm a pastor and teach adjunct professor at URI. I just wondered, are you familiar with some of the recent studies out of Hartford and another man named David Olson, who's done some hard challenging of the reporting of American religious attendance? In other words, it seems as though we've been living off of this certain high levels of reporting that don't line up with reality. And there's been some more, it seems like hard reality kinds of studies lately that are showing further declines, at least on that objective side of the religious spectrum. And then I guess more from my own observation, at least living in New England, it's a little bit different climate than the rest of, or other parts of the country in terms of the level of biblical ignorance and the blank slates of our students. And I just wondered, are you seeing any differences in how religiosity or religious climate is being measured in the country?
Well, there have been a number of people challenging data on church attendance. One group, some time ago, I forget his name, he teaches at Notre Dame, I think, who went around and compared what people said was church attendance in certain places, and then he and his students went around and counted cars in front of those churches, and there were not enough cars to explain the alleged attendance. I don't know. I mean, look, most data seem to indicate that church attendance is less on the two coasts than in the center of the country. The term Bible Belt, I think, has a certain reality to it. The South and the Southwest are more intensively religious by any criterion than, say, the Boston area or the San Francisco area. Beyond that, I don't know what to say. Church statistics in America are extremely unreliable because the census doesn't permit religious questions. So you're dealing with samples, you're dealing with what the churches themselves say, which is extremely unreliable. So I don't know. One thing one can say, I think, with great confidence is more people go to church in America than go to church in Europe. No question about it.
Final question. Here comes the question.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Berger. Evangelicals in America are often bemoaning their lack of, shall we say, intellectual leadership in America. In fact, recently we had the anniversary of Mark Noll's book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, was celebrated here with the conference. And this is often contrasted to some of the deliberate strategies of engagement in Europe. And I'm thinking especially of some of the leadership of the Catholic Church, Catholic social thought, culminating in things like Christian democratic political parties, which are absent here. Could you comment on how that difference between Europe and America, how that relates to your thesis?
The absence of Christian democratic parties in America?
Well, just this deliberate strategy of engagement with culture and politics and the state in Europe, which does not seem to have developed the same way here. Much more willingness to remain separate here, perhaps.
I don't know. I mean, the Christian democratic parties have mostly come out of Catholic social thought. I think one has to see this against the background of anti-Catholic, anti-clericalism. So there was an attempt to, when you look at the development of these parties, especially after World War II, in Italy, in Germany, and elsewhere, to say, look, we are for democracy, we were against fascism, we are not reactionary the way Catholic movements, Tal mentioned that before, we're before World War II, we are not that way at all. But we're also Catholic, and we want to have an influence in the state. And then Protestants bought into this, and certainly in Germany they did, some other countries as well. There was no need for this in America. And I think the Christian democratic idea was, I think, can be seen against the background of European secularity. Since there is no such background in America, it seems to me logical that such parties did not develop in America. I don't know if that. What would you say to that?
contrast. I don't know if I would add anything to that. I was actually formulating another question, and I was going to play the moderator's prerogative and ask the final question to you. But well, one thing you've mentioned in the book and elsewhere is as that sort of for the future of transatlantic or Western religiosity, evangelicalism is a significant variable. Whether it becomes more separatist, or whether it develops more of an evangelical mind. Do you have any closing thoughts on just the state of American evangelicalism, or even global evangelicalism for that matter?
Well, that's a big topic, but let me try to be brief. Christianity is the biggest religion in the world demographically, and it's growing phenomenally. In a number of China right now is fascinating from that point of view. Protestantism is more important than Catholicism in terms of the growth in the global South. Very heavy portion of that is Pentecostal. Southern, in the sense of what used to be called the Third World, the new term equally confusing is the global South. Protestantism in the global South is overwhelmingly evangelical. Even in denominations such as the Anglican Church, where this was not the dominant theme until very recently. So evangelicalism has an enormous global presence, not just in the United States. It's extremely significant from that point of view. It is rapidly developing middle-class characteristics in many countries. The interesting question is whether, as more and more evangelicals have higher education, achieve middle-class status in places like Latin America or Africa, how will they change? They will change to some extent, there's no question about it. Difficult to predict. I would say thus far, evangelicalism worldwide has not lost its vitality or its distinctive religious character. In the United States, there's some argument about it. You mentioned Hunter. He wrote a book now, about 25 years ago, in which he argued that evangelicals, I'm paraphrasing him, are becoming as boring as everybody else as they become more educated and more middle class. I think he's wrong. At least thus far, he's wrong. I don't know, what else shall I say? The Pentecostal phenomenon, with which our research center has been very much involved, is one of the most fascinating religious phenomena in the world today. It's having an enormous impact. The Pew Research Center, which made a study in 10 countries of Pentecostalism, estimated there are 600 million charismatic Christians in the world today. Now, maybe an exaggerated number. It's a huge phenomenon. And one thing I have been, well, not just me, we have a team working on these things, have emphasized is that it's basically a modernizing phenomenon. It's encouraging modern attitudes to work, to family life, etc. I don't know what else to say.
Okay, well, we can close things off there, but you might have any additional questions, you could come down. But join me in thanking Peter Berger for coming.